You can spend your whole life living in a house built by someone else, following their floor plans, their rules for where the light should fall, and one day, you realize you have been living in a museum of someone else's taste. And you are the only exhibit. Good evening, my dears. Settle in. Tonight, I want to talk to you about blueprints. Not the kind for buildings, but the kind for lives. For 34 years, I lived my married life according to a detailed, 10-page document my mother-in-law gave me. She called it guidance. I came to understand it was a cage made of parchment. This is the story of how I finally stopped being the contractor for her vision, and became the architect of my own peace. It's a story of quiet realization, not loud rebellion. Of a slow awakening that ended with the sound of my own front door closing, and a new key in my hand. I received that blueprint in a vanilla folder. The color of the folder was chosen, I am sure, for its neutrality, its lack of statement. It was the week before the wedding. A time that should have been about anticipation, about the flutter of a new beginning. For me it was the moment I received my operations manual. My mother-in-law Agatha, she never asked me to call her mom, handed it to me over tea in her perfect parlor. The china was so thin it felt like a promise that might break. She said it was for my own good. To avoid confusion, she said. To ensure harmony. She said her son Charles was a creature of habit, bred for a certain kind of life, and it would be easier for everyone if I understood the specifications. That word has echoed in my mind for 34 years. Specifications. Like I was an appliance he was acquiring. A refrigerator or a washing machine that needed to be installed correctly to function within the existing kitchen. I took the folder. I thanked her. I tucked it into my wedding planning binder between the fabric swatches for the bridesmaids, dresses, and the seating chart for the reception. I didn't read it, not properly. I was 23. I thought it was eccentric. I thought it was a gesture, perhaps a misguided one, from a woman who loved her son too much and saw me as an unknown variable in her carefully balanced equation. I thought I could humor her. I thought my love for Charles would be the stronger current that would wash away these silly little rules. I was so very young. The reading of it happened after the honeymoon. We went to Napa. The vineyards were rows of green hope. Charles was attentive in a distant way. He made the reservations, he drove the car, he ordered the wine. I was there as his pleasant companion. It was a preview, a subtle one I missed entirely. We returned to the house, his house, really a wedding gift from his parents. It was cold, all marble and sharp angles. He went back to work. The silence of that big empty house was a living thing. It wasn't peaceful. It was expectant. It was waiting for me to fill it with the correct sounds. I made a pot of tea. I sat at the vast kitchen table, my feet not quite touching the floor. And I opened the vanilla folder. The first thing I noticed was the type. Times New Roman. A font of authority. It was 10 pages. Single-spaced. Numbered and subheaded. It was not a mother's advice. It was a corporate policy manual for the position of wife. Page 1 was domestic protocol. It began not with warmth, not with wishes for happiness, but with the care of hardwood floors. The specific brand of polish. The direction of the mop strokes to avoid streaking. It moved to the laundering of his dress shirts. The starch amount for the collar versus the cuffs. The alignment of buttons on the hanging rack. Then it arrived at the newspaper. Rule 2.4. The newspaper is to be ironed before presentation at breakfast. This removes the ink smudges and prevents transfer to the fingers. I remember staring at that sentence. The ironing of a newspaper. I pictured myself standing at the board, the steam rising, pressing the politics and the sports and the obituaries into crisp, sterile sheets. It struck me then not as ridiculous but as profoundly revealing. This was about the elimination of mess. The prevention of smear. My role was to ensure nothing messy, nothing unpredictable, nothing human touched him. Not even the morning news. It moved through the house room by room. The precise angle for throw pillows on the settee. The frequency of rotating the Persian rugs to ensure even wear. The acceptable decibel level for the television after 8 p.m. The house was not a home. It was a museum, and I was its curator. My life was to be a series of preventive conservations. Page 2 was social calendar and acceptable acquaintances. It listed families whose associations were encouraged and those whose were to be politely avoided. The reasons were not given. They were encoded in a language of subtle cues. Their house is always in some disarray. He is in a volatile industry. She speaks too freely. My friendships, my own history, my people were not on any list. They were unknowns and therefore fell into the category of risk. I was to cultivate relationships that reflected well on his position. I was to host dinner parties with menus from page 3 and discuss topics from a narrow approved range. The weather, local charitable events, travel to certain destinations. I was to laugh at the correct pitch. A gentle chuckle, not a guffaw. A guffaw was messy. Page 4 was personal appearance and grooming. My hair was to be kept at or above collar length for manageability and a youthful appearance. The color was to be within 2 shades of my natural tone. Nails were to be filed short and polished in clear or pale pink. Stockings were to be worn with heels for all engagements outside the home, including grocery shopping. My wardrobe palette was suggested. Navy cream, taupe, burgundy, colors that blended, that didn't shout. My body was to be maintained. Not for health, not for joy, but for its presentation. There was a recommended weight range. There were notes on posture. On the modulation of my voice, which was apparently prone to a slight upward inflection that could be perceived as uncertainty. I was to end my sentences with periods, not question marks. Page 5 and 6 were the heart of the system. Communication guidelines. With him and with her. With Charles I was not to discuss matters of finance, politics, or automotive mechanics after 7 p.m. His mind required rest. I was to present household concerns not as problems but as solved situations, or at most gentle queries for his preference between 2 acceptable solutions I had already devised. I was to be a silent partner in his stress. I was to listen to his account of his day and offer validating statements. You handled that so well. That must have been frustrating for you. Your insight was impressive. My own day, my own internal world had no column in this ledger. With her it was more structured. Sunday telephone calls were non-negotiable. I was to prepare a summary of the week's events in advance. This was not a chat. It was a debriefing. I was to report on the state of the house, on any social interactions, on Charles's mood and health. I was to receive her instructions for the coming week. She would ask specific questions. Did you use the silver polish I sent? Has the gardener trimmed the boxwoods correctly? Did Charles enjoy the lamb recipe I provided? My answers were data points for her to assess my compliance, my performance. The calls always ended the same way. She would say, remember, a smooth home is the foundation of a man's success. And I would say, yes, Agatha. Thank you, Agatha. The financial page was the most clinical. I was given an allowance for household management. Groceries, utilities, maintenance. I was to keep receipts. Itemized. I was to present a monthly summary. Any personal expenses, clothing, haircuts were to be discussed as requests. There was no joint account. There was his account and there was the household budget I administered. My own money from the small job I had before the marriage was mine, she wrote, but its use should be discreet and not for anything that might raise questions. A financial system designed to create dependence and auditability. To ensure I could not without great difficulty build a resource outside of their view. And finally the last page. Long-term objectives and legacy. It spoke of children, their education, their socialization. It outlined the importance of family traditions, all of them hers. Holidays were not celebrations but rituals to be performed with exactitude. The goal was the cultivation of a certain lineage, a certain standing. A life that looked impeccable in a photo album and in the whispered assessments of their social circle. And at the bottom, in a handwriting that was not part of the typed document, a scrawl of blue ink, it said, a successful marriage is a perfectly managed institution. Love is a byproduct of good order. I sat there as the afternoon light faded in that cold kitchen. My tea was a cold scum in the bottom of the cup. The silence was no longer empty. It was thick with words, with 10 pages of words that described a life that was not a life but a tenure. A position. I was not to be a partner. I was to be a permanent resident manager. The blueprint offered no room for spontaneity, for bad days, disagreement, for lazy Sundays in bed. It had no category for grief or for joy that was to govern my very body, my voice, my thoughts. And the true erasure began not when I read it but when I filed it away. Not in the trash. I put it in my bedside table drawer. Because Charles came home, he performed his rituals, hanging his coat on the precise hook, pouring his sparkling water. He saw the papers on the table. Mother's notes, he said with a small fond smile. He came over and kissed the top of my head. She means well, thinks she's helping. His hand rested on my shoulder. Just file it away, darling. It will be easier. Those words became the mortar for every brick she laid. It will be easier. Easier than what? Easier than conflict. Easier than him having to choose between his mother's world and mine. Easier than him questioning the architecture he had always lived within. My filing away of the physical document was my first act of compliance. But the real erasure was the slow internalization. I began to measure myself against those pages. When I bought a dress in a color too bright, I heard the rustle of page 4. When I laughed too loud at a friend's joke, I heard the reprimand in page 2. When I felt sad for no reason and wanted to curl up on the sofa, I saw the throw pillows out of alignment and the judgment in page 1. The blueprint became an internal monitor. I no longer needed Agatha's voice. I had installed my own. A quiet, constant correction. You were too much. You were not enough. You were out of specification. The woman I was, the one who loved muddy colors and old jazz records, who had opinions about movies and politics, who could be stubborn and silly and fiercely loyal, that woman was not outlawed. She was simply rendered obsolete. There was no function for her in the system. So she receded. She became a ghost in the museum of my own life. A faint memory I would catch glimpses of sometimes in the mirror when I was tired before. The posture corrected itself. She was the ache I could not name, the loneliness that persisted in a crowd, the feeling that I was performing a play every single day and had long ago forgotten the script of my own soul. The blueprint did not just tell me what to do. It told me who I was allowed to be. And with every passing year, every ironed newspaper, every measured conversation, every Sunday report, that ghost grew fainter and the walls of the specification grew more solid, more real, until I could not tell where the blueprint ended and I began. That was the erasure. Not a violent deletion, but a gentle, relentless crowding out. A life replaced by a manual. A heart replaced by a handbook. And all with the silent approving nod of the man I loved, who found it easier to live in the world his mother built than to help me build a new one with him. This is the knot, the one that truly aches when I pull at the memory. It would be a simpler story, a cleaner one, if my husband Charles had been a monster. A villain twirling a mustache and locking me in a tower. It would be easier to explain if he had been a prisoner too, chafing against the same blueprints, whispering rebellion with me in the dark. But he was neither. He was the co-signer. The beneficiary. The man for whom the entire system was built and who found it not a cage but a comfortable, well-appointed home. His comfort, his quiet satisfaction, was the ultimate validation of her plan. It made my loneliness feel like a defect in me, not a flaw in the design. I saw it early, that blurry first year. A small thing. I had bought a throw pillow for the sofa. It was a vibrant embroidered thing I found at a market, all gold threads and deep magenta. It shouted joy. It clashed beautifully, terribly, with the taupe and navy of Agatha's prescribed palette. I placed it with a little thrill of defiance. Charles came home from work. He moved through his rituals, the coat, the water, the briefcase placed just so. He settled into his armchair, the one positioned for the best light for reading. He looked across the room. His gaze passed over the new pillow and then returned to it. A slight furrow appeared between his brows. Not anger, not disapproval, simply a soft puzzlement, as if he had encountered a mathematical equation with an extra number. He looked at me. Where did that come from, he asked. His tone was neutral. I told him I found it at the market. It reminded me of my grandmother's house. He nodded slowly. It's very bright, he said. And then he picked up his paper. The conversation was over. The pillow remained for a week. Every time he looked at it, that same faint perplexity. Not a word of criticism. Just a quiet, uncomprehending observation of something out of its natural habitat. By Sunday I moved it to the guest bedroom. A place for things that didn't fit. His relief was palpable, not in anything he said but in the way his shoulders relaxed when he took his seat that evening. The system had been restored. He hadn't demanded it. His comfort had. That was his role. He was not the warden. He was the living, breathing purpose of the institution. His needs, or rather the needs Agatha had defined for him, were the central tenets. A quiet home. Meals at precise times. Clothes in perfect order. A wife presented as a calm accessory. A social calendar that required no effort from him. His peace was the product. My labor was the invisible machinery that produced it. And because he was not a cruel man, he expressed gratitude. "You run a tight ship, my dear. The house always looked splendid. Dinner was excellent." This was his praise. It was praise for my management skills, for my execution of the specs. It was never praise for my laughter, for a surprising thought, for the light in my eyes. Those things were not part of the deliverables. His neglect was the most insidious kind, because it felt like trust. He trusted me to handle everything. The house, the schedules, the social niceties, the relationship with his mother. He abdicated gracefully, gratefully. He was free to focus on his work, his golf, his quiet contemplation. If I tried to bring him into a decision, a domestic puzzle, he would smile that vague pleasant smile and say, "I trust your judgment, darling. You know best." It felt like a compliment at first, an acknowledgement of my competence. But over years it became a vast lonely country. I was governing a territory alone. He was a friendly visiting dignitary who appreciated the lack of turmoil. He never asked how I built the roads. He just enjoyed the smooth ride. And when it came to his mother, he was not caught in the middle. He was firmly on her shore, looking across at me with gentle encouragement to swim over. When I would voice a tiny uncertainty about one of her directives, a tremor of weariness after a particularly demanding Sunday call, he would pat my hand. "It's just her way. She means well. You know, she only wants what's best for us." He would say, "Think of it as her loving us too much." He reframed control as care. He translated interference into devotion. And in doing so, he made my resistance seem ungrateful, small, petty. If I pushed further, if I said, "But it doesn't feel loving to me, it feels controlling," his expression would shift to genuine bewildered hurt. "Why must you look for conflict? Can't you just let it be?" He was not choosing her over me. In his mind there was no choice to make. Her world was the only real one. I was the new element being gently assimilated. My failure to assimilate seamlessly was a perplexing inconvenience, a slight ripple in his otherwise placid pond. I think of the children question. I wanted a child fiercely. Agatha's blueprint had a section on children, of course. Their schooling, their manners, their appropriate extracurriculars. It was a subsection of legacy. Charles was amenable. He liked the idea in theory. A son to teach golf to. A daughter to present at debutante balls. But when Lena arrived screaming and glorious and utterly unpredictable, the blueprint failed. It had no protocol for colic, for all-night rocking, for pure instinctual need. I flourished in that chaos. I finally had a purpose that came from my gut, not from a manual. I shed the rules. I wore pajamas all day. I sang off-key lullabies. The house was a mess of blankets and bottles and pure raw love. Charles retreated. The crying jangled his nerves. The mess offended his sense of order. He would come home and instead of the pristine sanctuary, a place where his mind could unwind, he found a domestic emergency zone. He was kind. He would ask, "Do you need anything?" and when I said, "Just your company, just hold her for a while," he would look at the squalling red-faced bundle in my arms with that same polite puzzlement. "I might jostle her," he would say. "You're so much better at this." And he would retreat to his study, to the ordered world of paperwork where cause and effect were clear. His absence wasn't malicious. It was logistical. He was opting out of the malfunctioning part of the system. He supported us financially, of course. He was proud in a distant way. But he did not engage. He parented from the blueprint when he did at all. Is that appropriate for a girl her age? Should she be making that much noise? What would mother suggest? He was a consultant to my chaotic startup, not a partner in the venture. And with every year of this, his role solidified. He was the beneficiary, the client. I was the service provider. Our marriage became a business with a silent board member who held majority shares. Our intimacy faded into a mild congeniality. We shared a bed like polite roommates who respected each other's space. Our conversations were updates. The gardener came. The car needs servicing. The Johnsons are coming for dinner on the 10th. We stopped touching except in perfunctory ways. A peck on the cheek. A hand on the shoulder. The deep loneliness of those years was not the loneliness of being alone. It was the loneliness of being profoundly unseen while constantly in someone's view. He looked at me and saw the wife. The manager. The mother of his child. He did not see the woman drowning in the specification. He saw the surface, and the surface was calm. Therefore all was well. When the regrets began to seep into my bones, when the quiet despair started, it did not manifest as fights with him. How do you fight with a pleasant reflection? You shout at a mirror and your own face shouts back. My sadness, my frustration confused him. Are you unwell? Have you seen a doctor? Perhaps you need more rest. He would diagnose my soul sickness as a physical or logistical problem. A vitamin deficiency. A need for a new hobby. Something to be managed and solved. He could not comprehend that the system itself was the illness. The system that gave him such peace. The day I finally understood his complicity completely was not a dramatic one. It was a Tuesday. I had attempted a new recipe, one from my own childhood, not from Agatha's file. It was a bit spicy, fragrant with memories. He took a bite, chewed thoughtfully. It's different, he said. Then after a moment, it's not mother's. There was no criticism in the statement. It was a simple observation of fact. Like noting the sky was green. It was not the recipe approved by the board. I asked, do you like it? He took another careful bite. It's fine, he said, but you know how I prefer the usual. And he gave me a smile that was meant to be kind. A preference, not a rule, but in that moment I saw it. He preferred the world she built. He preferred the flavors she endorsed. He preferred the wife she had designed, because that wife never surprised him, never asked him to taste something unfamiliar. His loyalty was not to her over me. His loyalty was to the comfort of the known. And I was part of the known now, but only so long as I stayed within the lines. I was the familiar flavor. To step outside of that was to become a surprise. And Charles did not care for surprises. That was the moment the knot tightened. The co-signer. He had signed every page with his quiet contentment, his polite withdrawals, his bewildered retreats from anything messy or real. He had funded the construction with his emotional absence. He had inhabited the structure so fully he mistook it for the sky. And when I finally picked up my tools to build something of my own, he did not try to stop me out of malice. He simply could not see the point. The old house was perfectly adequate. It met all the specifications. Why would anyone ever want to leave? They think the breaking point will be loud. They wait for the earthquake, for the thunderclap, for the slammed door that rattles the windows in their frames. They think a woman snaps like a dry branch. But that's not how it happens. Not for women like me who have lived a lifetime in the quiet. The foundation of a wrong life doesn't crack with a scream. It settles. It sighs. It gives way under the unbearable weight of 1,000 silent days. The cracks appear in the hush. They are hairline fractures at first. Almost invisible. You feel them before you see them. A sudden chill in a room that should be warm. A strange hollowness in a phrase you've spoken 1,000 times. A view from a window that looks less like a landscape and more like a painting you've been staring at for decades, until the colors have bled together into a dull and formless gray. My cracks began as absences. As missing pieces of sound. The silence of my own voice when I had something to say but knew the listening was not there. The silence of his side of the car on long drives when the radio played but no words passed between us. The silence of the bedroom after the lights went out, a void so thick it had its own texture. Those silences were not peaceful. A peaceful silence is a shared thing, a comfortable muteness between two people who know they can speak whenever they wish. This was different. This was the silence of a performance that has run too long. The audience is gone but the actor remains on stage mouthing the lines to an empty house. The echo of your own voice in the emptiness is the first crack. You hear the hollow ring of it. The 20th anniversary was a Tuesday. I know because Tuesdays were beef tenderloin. Rule 3.8. Tuesday is red meat for fortitude. I prepared it as I always had. I set the table with the good silver, the one Agatha had selected for us. I wore a dress, a navy one from the approved palette. I did not expect a party. I did not expect a trip to Paris or a diamond bracelet. After 20 years of the blueprint, you learn to temper your expectations until they are little more than faint hopes easily extinguished. But I suppose some stubborn ember in me, some last remnant of the girl who had believed in love stories, expected a word. A card. A single rose laid on my pillow. A look across the table that said, I see you. I see these 20 years. I see the life we have built, even if it was built on another woman's plans. I wanted an acknowledgement that the time had passed, that it had meant something. He came home at 9:30. The board dinner had run late. I heard the key in the lock, the precise hang of the coat, the footsteps on the marble. He walked into the kitchen where I stood by the stove keeping a single plate warm. He loosened his tie. He went to his study first to check his email. A protocol. When he returned he saw the plate. "Oh, you shouldn't have waited," he said. "I ate at the club." He said it lightly without malice. It was a simple statement of fact. He was not hungry. The food was unnecessary. He glanced at the wall calendar, the practical corporate one with the company logo. He squinted at the date. The 17th. "Is there something?" His voice trailed off. A genuine polite inquiry. He was scanning the files in his mind. The 17th. A client meeting. A deadline. A social obligation his wife had logged for him. I looked at him. I held the warm plate in my hands and I looked at him. I saw the man I had shared a bed with for 20 years. I had washed his clothes, cooked his meals, borne his child. I had stood beside him at parties and funerals and parent-teacher conferences. I had laughed at his jokes and soothed his headaches and listened to the stories of his triumphs. I had built my entire adult existence around the shape of his life. And as he stood there squinting at the calendar, I saw that to him I was not a woman with an anniversary. I was a function, a system that managed dates and meals and social logistics. And the system had not alerted him to this particular date. Therefore it could not be important. "No," I said. My voice was calm. It came out flat like still water. "Nothing at all." I turned and placed the plate in the sink. The clink of the china against the stainless steel was a tiny sound. It was the sound of that last ember going out. Not with a hiss but with a small clean click. Like a light switch being turned off in a room already dark. That was a crack. A deep one. I felt it run right through the center of me. Not a break. A fissure. A silent separation. After that I began to hear the other silences. They were everywhere. The silence of his interest. I would talk about a book I was reading and I could see the polite glaze come over his eyes, a gentle film between my words and his understanding. He would nod and say, "That sounds interesting," and the conversation would end. The silence of his curiosity. He never asked me what I thought about the news, about a film, about the strange dream I'd had. The silence of his touch. When he did reach for me it was habitual. A hand on the small of my back to guide me through a door. A perfunctory kiss on the cheek. It was management. It was not connection. The most profound silence lived in the spaces between his mother's words and his compliance. I would come from a Sunday call, my spirit feeling scrubbed raw with the bristle of her scrutiny. I would sit beside him on the sofa. He would sense my tension, my quiet defeat. He would pat my knee. "She only wants what's best," he would say. And then he would return to his paper. The silence that followed was not empty. It was full of everything unsaid. It was full of my scream that stayed lodged in my throat. It was full of the question, "Why can't you want what's best for me?" It was full of the crushing realization that in his world her wants and what was best were the same thing. That silence became a chamber I lived in. I started to notice the silence of my own reflection. I would pass a mirror and the woman looking back was a stranger. Her hair was correct. Her clothes were in order. Her face was composed. But her eyes were quiet. Too quiet. The lively light, the spark of a thought, the flash of irritation or delight that used to live there was gone. It had been replaced by a watchful stillness. The stillness of an animal that does not want to be seen. I was hiding in plain sight. From him, from her, from the world. And the most terrifying part was I was starting to hide from myself. The interior noise of my own mind, my opinions, my desires, my fears was being muffled under a thick blanket of "Don't be too much, don't make a wave, don't disturb the peace." The blueprint's final victory was this internal silence. It wasn't that I was forbidden to speak. It was that I could no longer find the words. My own vocabulary of self was fading. When I tried to reach for a feeling to name it, all I could grasp were the approved terms. "A little tired. Fine, thank you. Everything is under control." The rich, messy human language of the heart, the wistfulness, the rage, the searing loneliness, the stubborn joy, that language had gone dormant. That was the deepest crack of all. The silencing of my own soul. It didn't happen in an argument. It happened on an ordinary Thursday. I was in the grocery store. I was in the produce section holding a sweet potato. I was following the weekly menu. Thursday was roasted chicken with root vegetables. I stood there under the fluorescent lights surrounded by the quiet murmur of other people's lives. And a question formed in that silent place. It rose up slow and cold like a bubble from the depths of a frozen lake. Is this all there is? The question was so simple, so devastatingly plain. It wasn't asked in anger. It was asked in a tone of pure curious despair. Is this all there is? The beef tenderloin on Tuesdays. The ironed newspapers. The Sunday reports. The approved palate. The polite distant companionship of a pleasant stranger. The silencing. The settling. The slow fade to gray. I put the sweet potato in my cart. I pushed the cart to the checkout. I drove home. I put the groceries away. But the question had broken the final seal on the silence. It had been spoken in the inner chamber and now it echoed. It wouldn't stop echoing. Is this all there is? It was in the steam from the iron as I pressed his shirt. Is this all there is? It was in the sound of his key in the lock at 6:15. Is this all there is? It was in the mirror in the eyes of the quiet woman. That question was the crack that split the foundation. It was not a shout. It was a whisper, but some whispers are more powerful than screams. They are the voice of truth finally speaking after a long, long sleep. And once truth starts whispering, it does not stop. It finds its way into every silent corner. It shines a light on every settled layer of dust. It asks its simple, terrible, beautiful question until you can no longer pretend you don't hear it. Until you are finally ready to answer. My rebellion did not begin with a manifesto. It did not start with a fiery speech delivered across the dinner table or a dramatic burning of the vanilla folder in the backyard fire pit. That would have been a performance. A scene. And a scene would have given them a role to play, the shocked husband, the aggrieved mother, the hysterical wife. It would have fit a narrative they understood. My power came from a place they could not comprehend. It came from the deep quiet. It was not a war cry. It was a whisper. A series of whispers so small, so delicate they were almost inaudible. But a whisper in a dead silent room can be the loudest sound in the world. The first whisper was a Wednesday. Charles was at the office. Agatha was at her weekly salon appointment, a 3-hour ritual of set and style. The house was mine, truly mine for a solid block of hours. The silence that day did not feel heavy. It felt expectant. I stood in the middle of the perfect living room and I listened. Not with my ears but with my skin. I felt the stillness of the throw pillows placed just so. I saw the sunbeam cutting across the rug at the exact angle it did every afternoon. I heard the faint hum of the refrigerator, a sound so constant it had become part of the silence. And the whisper came. It said go. I did not plan it. I walked to my closet. I did not reach for the approved palette. I put on a pair of old linen trousers that had grown soft and a sweater the color of a faded brick. A color Agatha would have called muddy. I did not look in the mirror to check the effect. I took my purse, my keys. I got in the car. And I drove. I had no destination. I simply followed the whisper. It led me away from the manicured lawns and the symmetrical hedges, away from the neighborhood that was a monument to good order. I drove until the houses thinned out. I drove until I saw a sign for the coast. The whisper grew a little louder. It hummed along with the tires on the asphalt. I had not seen the ocean in years. Agatha thought beaches were common. Sandy, uncontrolled. Charles found them monotonous. The same water, the same noise. So we went to mountains, to cities, to places with schedules and sites and approved restaurants. The sea was not on the itinerary. I parked in a gravel lot. I took off my shoes, my sensible leather flats. I left them in the car. I walked across the cool sand in my stocking feet, feeling the grit that give the unexpected softness. The wind was a living thing. It pulled at my hair, my muddy-colored sweater. It was not a gentle breeze. It was a tousling, insistent force. I stood at the edge where the water met the sand and I let it happen. I let the wind ruin the set of my hair. I let the salt spray touch my face. I closed my eyes. The sound was immense. It was not a single sound but a symphony of chaos, the crash, the hiss, the cry of gulls, the whistle in my ears. It was the opposite of silence. It was a glorious, beautiful noise. I sat on a rock. I did not think about what time it was. I did not worry about sand in my stockings. I just sat and let the noise wash over me. And inside the center of that storm of sound I found a perfect quiet. My own quiet. For the first time in decades, the buzzing monitoring voice in my head, the one that quoted the blueprint, fell silent. It was drowned out by the sea. That was my first act of sabotage. Not a confrontation, a visitation. I had gone to the one place the blueprint had never thought to govern. And I had come back different. There was sand in the seams of my trousers. There was salt on my skin. A tiny wild rebellion trapped in the fibers of my clothing brought back into the museum. The whispers grew more frequent. They became a new kind of internal navigation. They did not speak in rules. They spoke in feelings. What brings you peace? The whisper asked one afternoon as I polished silver. The answer arose not from my mind but from a deeper place. The smell of earth after rain. The weight of a book in my hands. The color of lavender. These were not grand desires. They were tiny stolen truths. I began to save money. Not from the household account. That was audited, but from the personal allowance the blueprint allotted for my maintenance. Money for haircuts, for stockings, for the occasional lunch with an approved acquaintance. I became frugal in a way that would have pleased Agatha's sense of thrift, but for a purpose she would have condemned. I bought cheaper shampoo. I mended a seam instead of replacing a blouse. The coins and bills I saved I hid in the hollow of an old book, a novel Agatha would never approve of. It was my secret fund. Not for escape yet, just for possibility. The act of saving was itself a whisper. A no said to their control, a yes said to my own future. The search for the cottage was not a search. It was a following. I found myself driving to coastal towns on my stolen Wednesdays. I would get a coffee at a local diner and I would listen. I would look at notices in grocery store windows. I was not in a hurry. This was not an escape plan. It was a daydream I was allowing myself to touch. And then I saw it. A faded photograph on a tired piece of paper. Small cottage needs love. It was tucked between a flyer for boat repairs and one for guitar lessons. The roof sagged. The garden was a jungle. The paint was bleached by salt and wind. It was the most beautiful thing I had ever seen. It was a house that had given up on blueprints long ago. Calling the number was a whisper so quiet I almost didn't hear myself speak. Meeting the contractor Sarah, a woman with sun-bleached hair and a tape measure clipped to her belt, was like meeting an ambassador from a country I had only read about. She did not ask me about my husband's preferences. She asked me what I loved. Where did I want the light to fall in the morning? Did I like deep windowsills for plants? What kind of sound did I want the front door to make when it closed? These questions were a foreign language. A beautiful poetic language of self. I learned to speak it haltingly. I want peace. I want to hear the trees. I want a room that feels like a sigh. Every decision for that broken down cottage was an act of quiet defiance. I chose a paint color called driftwood because I liked the name. I chose a floor of wide pine planks that would show scratches and dents. I designed a window seat that looked out at nothing but the sky and the line of the sea. There were no rules for any of it. There was only the whisper. Do you like this? And I would wait in the new silence I was cultivating inside myself until the answer came. Yes, or no, simple, and justified. I would come home from these pilgrimages to the coast with sand in my shoes and paint samples in my pocket. I would walk back into the cold marble order of the house on Maple Drive and it felt like walking onto a stage set. I was an actress returning from a break, remembering her lines. But the sand was real. The paint chip in my pocket was real. They were tangible evidence of the other life, the real life slowly taking shape. The most powerful whisper was the one that told me to be still. To not reveal my hand. There is a strength in secrecy that the controlling mind cannot defeat. They can't fight what they can't see. Agatha's Sunday calls continued. I gave my reports. The house is fine. Charles as well. Yes, the boxwoods were trimmed. I spoke the truth, but not all of it. The truth was the house was fine, but I had found a home. Charles was well, but I was becoming whole. The boxwoods were trimmed, but I was planting lavender. I became a master of the true neutral statement. I fed her the information she craved while nourishing my own soul in a secret garden she knew nothing about. This was my rebellion, not a battle fought on their field but a quiet secession. I was withdrawing my spirit brick by brick. I was transferring my allegiance from their institution to my own soul. Every choice for the cottage, every saved dollar, every moment of peace by the sea was a silent vote for myself. It was a slow, patient weaving of a new reality right under the surface of the old one. The day the cottage was finished, Sarah handed me the key. It was heavy, solid. It felt like a promise kept. I walked through the empty rooms. The light fell just as I had hoped. The floorboards creaked a welcome. The silence here was different. It was a silence full of potential. It was my silence. I owned it. I had built it. I drove back to Maple Drive for the last time. I packed a single suitcase with clothes that felt like me. The rest of it, the uniform of the blueprint, could stay. I made the beef tenderloin. I set the table. I performed the ritual one final time, not as a prisoner but as a free woman giving a graceful farewell performance. My rebellion was complete not when I left but in the months and years of whispers that led me to that door. It was in the sand, in the shoes, the paint chip in the pocket, the secret bankbook in the hollow novel. It was in the quiet colossal no that built a yes strong enough to hold a new life. I did not fight their world. I simply built my own. And in the end, a world of your own making is the only territory that truly matters. Leaving was not an act of walking away. It was an act of walking into the final step in a contract I had written for myself in invisible ink over years of quiet whispers. It was not an escape. It was a completion, a closing ceremony for a life that had reached its natural conclusion, like a book whose final sentence had been written long before the cover was shut. There was no drama to be mined from it. Drama requires conflict and surprise. There was no conflict because I had withdrawn from the battlefield. There was no surprise because I had already left in every way that mattered. This was merely the physical manifestation of a spiritual truth that had already settled into my bones. That last Tuesday holds a strange crystalline clarity in my memory. It was not charged with emotion. It was procedural. I moved through the familiar spaces of the house on Maple Drive with the detached focus of a stagehand after the final curtain. This was the last performance. I would give it my full attention, not for them but for myself. To mark the ending with intention, I took the beef tenderloin from the refrigerator. Rule 3.8. I seasoned it precisely. I preheated the oven. I set the table with the sterling silver flatware, each piece heavy and cool in my hand. I placed the napkins in their rings. I filled the water glasses. I moved with a calm economy. There was no resentment in the motions. They were simply the last rotations of a wheel that was about to stop turning forever. I went upstairs. I opened my closet. I looked at the rows of garments, the navy, the taupe, the cream, the burgundy. They hung there like empty skins. I did not pack them. They belonged to the wife of the blueprint. They had no place where I was going. I packed a single suitcase. It contained the linen trousers, the faded brick sweater, clothes that smelled of sea air and my own skin. It held a few books whose spines were cracked from my reading. A photograph of Lena as a child, her face alight with a laugh. The small everyday things that were mine. The suitcase was not heavy. It was a relief to carry so little. Before I went back downstairs, I took the vanilla folder from its drawer. It felt lighter than I remembered. The weight had never been in the paper. I carried it to the dining room. I placed it on the table mat to the right of his plate where a report might be placed for review. I took a pen from the desk. A simple black ballpoint. I opened the folder to the final page, to the handwritten scrawl about love being a byproduct of good order. And beneath it, in my own clear script, I wrote the final clause. The architect has retired. The building is condemned. It was not an insult. It was a structural assessment. A declaration of fact. The original architect, Agatha, had withdrawn her active influence through death or distance, it mattered not. And the building, the institution of the marriage, could no longer stand. Its foundation was rotten with silence, its beams weakened by neglect, its rooms empty of true life. It was unfit for habitation. Condemned. I stood for a moment looking at the table. The gleaming silver. The folded napkin. The vanilla folder. It was a perfect still life. A museum exhibit titled A Marriage, Specifications Met. Then I took off my wedding ring. It slid off my finger with an ease that shocked me. I had thought it would be difficult, that my flesh would have grown around it. But it came away as easily as a button unfastened. I placed it on top of the folder. The diamond chosen for its clarity and carat according to Agatha's guidelines caught the light from the chandelier. It made a soft definitive click against the paper. That was the only sound. The front door opened. I heard the precise rhythm of his entry. The hang of the coat. The pause at the mirror. His footsteps approached the dining room. He appeared in the doorway. He saw the table. He saw me standing there. A faint smile touched his lips. A Tuesday smile. A beef tenderloin smile. He came to his chair. He noticed the folder. His brow furrowed not with concern but with mild bureaucratic curiosity. "What's this?" "Old tax papers." His voice was light. He sat down. "Open it," I said. My voice was the same one I had used for 34 years. Calm, pleasant, even. He opened the folder. He saw the familiar typed pages. He flipped them, not reading, just confirming their identity. Then he saw the last page. My note. His eyes moved across the words. I watched his face. I saw the process. First confusion, a slight squint as if the words were in a language he had studied long ago but forgotten. Then a slow dawning. The words parsed. Architect. Retired. Building. Condemned. His head lifted. He looked at me not with anger but with pure bewildered incomprehension. "I don't understand. Is this a joke?" His tone was that of a man presented with a nonsensical memo from a subordinate. "No, Charles. It's an evacuation notice." I said it gently. I was not issuing a challenge. I was stating a policy change. He blinked. "A what?" "Evacuation notice." He gave a short baffled laugh. "From what?" "From this." My gesture was small, encompassing the room, the silver, the folder. "For 34 years I have lived in a house designed by your mother. I followed every specification. I became the wife she blueprinted. And you were the perfect tenant. You never complained. You never asked for a single change. Because it suited you." His face shifted from confusion to a mild affronted irritation. The irritation of a man whose routine has been interrupted. "That's not fair. We have a good life. A comfortable life." He said comfortable as if it were the highest virtue. The ultimate achievement. "We have her life," I said. The calm in my voice was a deep still lake, unrippled by his frustration. "And I am tired of being the contractor for a dream I never had." I picked up my suitcase from where it rested beside the sideboard. The movement was simple, final. He stared at the suitcase as if it were a bizarre artifact that had materialized in his dining room. "Where will you go?" The question was automatic, practical, the first question one asks when someone is leaving. But beneath it I heard the first thin note of something unfamiliar in his voice. A tremor of panic. Not panic at losing me but panic at the sudden unexplained variance in the blueprint. A moving part had detached itself from the machine. "I built my own house, Charles." The simplicity of the statement seemed to confound him more than any accusation could have. His mouth opened slightly. No sound came out. He looked from me to the folder, to the ring on top of it. The pieces would not connect. A wife builds her own house. It was not in the schema. It violated every principle of management. I did not wait for a response. There was nothing more to say. The conversation was over. The contract was void. I walked to the front door. I did not look back at the dining room, at the tableau of a life I was leaving. I had already said my goodbyes to those rooms in 1,000 silent ways over the preceding years. I opened the door. The evening air was cool. It smelled of cut grass and distant rain. Not of salt. Not yet. I stepped over the threshold. I closed the door behind me. Softly, the latch engaged with a quiet but absolute click. That was it. That was the leaving. No shouted final words. No tears on the marble floor. No slamming echo. Just a soft click. The sound of a door closing on a finished chapter. I put my suitcase in the trunk of my car. I got in the driver's seat. I did not cry. I did not feel a rush of exhilaration. I felt a profound and steady certainty. I had signed my name to my own life. I had issued the final order. The evacuation was complete. The building was empty. All that remained was to go home. As I drove away from Maple Drive for the last time, I looked in the rearview mirror. The house stood there, a monument to good order, every light in its proper window. It looked like a picture from a magazine. Beautiful, lifeless. Already it seemed like a place I had visited long ago, a museum I had worked in. The connection was severed so cleanly it was as if it had never been a living bond at all, but a professional arrangement that had reached its natural termination. The quiet in the car was not the old silence. It was my silence. It was full of the hum of the engine, the sound of tires on pavement, the whisper of my own free breath. I was not running from something. I was driving toward something. I had not abandoned a post. I had fulfilled my contract to the letter, and now I was released. My leaving was the final dignified sentence in a story that had been written for me. From now on I would hold the pen. The page was blank and the quiet was my own. The house I built has only one rule. Breathe. That is the entirety of my new blueprint. A single word. A verb. Not a restriction but an invitation. An instruction so simple, so fundamental that for 34 years I had performed it without ever truly feeling the fullness of it. Here in this cottage by the edge of the sea I have learned what it means. To draw air into your own lungs and release it on your own terms. To let the rhythm of your breath find its own syncopation against the sound of the waves. To fill a space with the quiet evidence of your own alive presence. This is my only law. The peace here is not an absence of sound. It is a fullness of the right sounds. It is the constant low thunder of the ocean, a sound so deep it is felt in the chest before it is heard in the ears. It is the cry of the gulls, a lonely beautiful sound that speaks of freedom and distance. It is the wind in the sea pines, a sigh that moves through the branches and then moves on. It is the creak of my own floorboards under my own bare feet. These are the sounds of a world that moves according to larger, older rhythms. They do not care about polished silver or approved palettes. They do not recognize a social calendar. They simply are, and in their presence the buzzing anxious static of my old life, the internal recitation of rules and failures simply faded. Like a radio signal growing weaker as you drive out of the city until finally there is only the clean empty frequency of your own station. My cottage is small. The rooms are not grand. The windows are framed in simple wood, not polished brass. The walls are painted a color I chose because it reminded me of the sky just before dawn. I called it First Light. No committee approved it. I simply pointed and said that one. There are scratches on the pine floor from dragging a chair. There is a water stain on the windowsill from a forgotten pot of lavender. These marks are not flaws. They are a record, a history of living, of things being moved and plants being watered and life leaving its gentle trace. In the house on Maple Drive a scratch would have been a defect, a failure in maintenance to be reported and repaired. Here it is a memory, a part of the story. I have a garden. It is not landscaped. It is a tangle of things that decided to grow. Rosemary that spills over the path. Lavender that hums with bees in the afternoon. A stubborn climbing rose that attacks the side of the shed with joyful abandon. I do not trim it into submission. I let it be wild. I watch the way the light falls on it in the morning. I learn its habits. Sometimes I pull a weed not because it is unsightly but because it is choking something I love. It is a different kind of care. It is not control. It is companionship. My days have no blueprint. I wake when the light finds the gap in my curtain. I make tea and I take it to the window seat. I watch the sea. It is never the same. Some days it is a flat sheet of hammered silver. Other days it is a raging field of whitecaps and fury. I do not have a preference. I am learning to appreciate its many moods. I read books. Not books I should read. Books I want to read. Sometimes I read the same page 3 times because my mind wanders to the sound of the wind. That is allowed. There is no test. There is no report. I cook for one. I make meals that Agatha would have found absurd. A single baked potato with too much butter. A bowl of soup eaten directly from the pot. A salad of things I picked from the garden. I eat when I am hungry. I leave the dishes in the sink sometimes until the next morning. The world does not end. The silence of the house is not judging me. It is holding space for me. Charles called, of course, many times. The calls were like echoes from the old world. At first confusion. I don't understand what you want. We can fix this. Come home and we'll talk. Then negotiation. Would it help if we saw a counselor? If I spoke to mother? Then a dawning hollow regret. The house is so quiet. I can't find the insurance documents. What temperature do I wash the whites? His voice on the phone was the voice of a man standing in a museum after all the exhibits have been removed. He was surrounded by the empty frames, the dusty pedestals, but the meaning of the place was gone. The curator had resigned and taken all the knowledge with her. He drove here once. I saw his car, a familiar sleek silhouette, pause at the end of the lane. He did not come to the door. He got out and stood by the gate. He looked at the wild rosemary bush tumbling over the fence. He looked at the unmowed grass, the flaking paint on the garden bench. He looked at the light in my window. I saw him from where I sat. The glass between us felt like more than a pane. It felt like a boundary between two separate realities. He looked small out there. Diminished. Not by anger or spite, but by the sheer incomprehensible fact of my existence here. I had become a reality he could not factor into his equations. A variable that had declared its own value. I did not invite him in. This house has no protocol for ghosts. No rule for hosting the specter of a past life. To invite him in would have been to let the old blueprint cross the threshold. To risk measuring my wild rosemary against his memory of trimmed boxwoods. I let him stand. He stood for a long time just looking. Then he got back in his car and drove away. He never came back. That was his final silence. The silence of a man who has run out of questions because he cannot understand the answers. Some people might think my story is about revenge. They see the peaceful cottage, the quiet life, and they think, ah, she won. She showed them. But that is a misunderstanding. Revenge is a fever. It requires you to keep looking back to measure the wound you inflicted, to monitor the regret in the other person's eyes. It is a poison you brew for them that you end up drinking yourself. My piece is not about them. It is not a reaction. It is a creation. I do not think of Agatha's rules. I do not tally Charles's regrets. Their memories have no power here. They are like old newspapers left out in the rain. The ink has bled, the words have become illegible. They are just pulp now. Returning to the earth. The greatest freedom is not making someone regret losing you. The greatest freedom is building a life so peaceful, so truly and completely your own, that their memory simply floats away. It loses its weight. It becomes anecdote, background. It does not sting or ache. It just is. A fact like any other. I was married for 34 years. I lived in a big house on Maple Drive. Now I live in a small cottage by the sea. That is all. Here I am not a wife. I am not a daughter-in-law. I am not a manager of a static life. I am simply a woman. A woman who wakes and breathes and makes tea and tends her garden. A woman who is learning the names of the birds that visit her feeder. A woman who sometimes dances in her kitchen to a song on the radio for no reason at all. I am becoming reacquainted with myself. With the girl I was before the vanilla folder. I am finding her in my love of wildflowers. In my preference for salty air over perfume. In the way I still hum a tune my grandmother taught me. This is the house I built. Not from timber and nails alone, but from silence and choice and the slow accumulation of whispered yeses. It is a house with a heartbeat that is my own. Its rule is simple: breathe. And I do. Deeply. Fully. The salt air fills my lungs, the wind tells its stories, and the vast ancient rhythm of the sea reminds me that I am small and my life is my own, and that after a long, long winter of the soul it is finally spring. The blueprint is gone. In its place there is only this wide open horizon and the quiet, relentless, beautiful work of being alive.